one of the things that's special about Bob is that Bob understands that all youngsters can learn. And it doesn't matter what their zip code is. It doesn't matter what their race is. It doesn't matter what their religion is or what the beliefs of the family are or how much money the family has. What is important is getting a good, solid education. He has made it his business to make a difference for those youngsters, and the world is a better place because of an extraordinary leader, an extraordinary educator, a brilliant man like Robert Sperber. Bob was so admired, so well respected, and held in such high regard that Cardinal Sean O'Malley bestowed upon him the Bishop Cheverus Medal for his volunteerism and for his huge contributions to Catholic education. And that is quite an honor given to very, very few people.
I have three core beliefs. First, a commitment to equity for students. Second, the notion that it's important to create innovative ideas that last. And finally, a belief that education is an instrument of social justice. I was born in June 1929, four months before the Great Depression. My dad was a dental technician, and my mom was a stay-at-home mom taking care of the house. In 1934, I went to PS 86 in the Bronx. I then took the exam for Bronx Science and was passed it and came there in 1943. I was a pre-med student when I went off to Western Reserve University in Cleveland, but after getting a D in organic chemistry, I knew it wasn't for me, and so I switched to history as my major and did my student teaching out in Shaker Heights, Ohio. I came back to New York and went to Teachers College, Columbia University, to get my master's degree. And then got my first teaching job in Levittown, Long Island in 1952. I remember two things at that point. My starting salary was $3,400, and because this was the McCarthy era, I had to sign a loyalty oath as a teacher. After 2 months of teaching 8th grade, I was drafted in the Army. Because I had a master's degree after basic training, the Army kept me at Fort Dix, where I had done my training, and I processed soldiers to go to Korea. In 1956, I was working on my doctorate at Teachers College, Columbia, and the Kellogg Foundation from Battle Creek, Michigan, was funding a program to identify promising teachers who wanted to go directly into the superintendency. And I was part of that program. And they placed me as an administrative assistant to the superintendent of schools in Westfield, New Jersey. I was in a doctoral seminar at Teachers College, and the professor threw out a request or threw out an idea that intrigued me, and that was to look at the issue of federal aid to education. Up until that time, the Congress had never passed an education bill because they claimed that federal aid would lead to federal control. I was very interested in that topic and stepped forward and under the tutelage of John Norton, who was my professor, we sent out surveys to 3,000 school districts impacted by Public Law 874, and the results indicated that in 99% of the cases, there was absolutely no influence by the federal government over either what had to be taught or who had to be hired. That research was then used by the National Education Association to influence the Congress, and in 1965, the Congress, based on that testimony, passed the National Defense Education Act. And several years later, I went before the United States Senate Subcommittee on Education and gave testimony. I think that was in about 1961. And then, of course, the NDEA Act was passed in 1965. From 56 to 59, I was working in Westfield and obtained a position in 59 as administrative assistant to the superintendent in Plainview, Long Island. Coincidentally, at that point, Calvin Gross, who was a nationally known superintendent of schools in Pittsburgh, was in conversation with Ellsbury and said, I'm looking for someone to come out here and head the personnel division in the Pittsburgh Public Schools. And because I had been working with Willard Ellsbury in Plainview, he recommended me, and I was hired by Gross. I came there in 1961 to Pittsburgh. I was responsible for hiring and supervising 5,000 teachers in the Pittsburgh schools. What I learned when I came out to Pittsburgh was that white teachers only taught white children and black teachers only taught black kids. And I knew that I couldn't live with that, and so I began a program called Conscious Preferment, in which all other factors being equal, we would hire black teachers for teaching positions. And it got national attention. And as a result of it, my life was threatened by anonymous threats that came out of the Deep South. I also stepped up our recruiting program and went to a number of Southern colleges to recruit black teachers to come up to Pittsburgh. We increased the number of black teachers, and we also, for the first time, recruited black teachers to become principals, and we brought some of the black principals, after they've had some experiences, came into the central office as well, which formerly had been an all-white situation. I got a call one day in my office from Teachers College, and they said that there was a superintendency in Brookline, Massachusetts. Would I be interested? And of course, since I was working towards becoming a superintendent, I indicated that I certainly was interested. At the same time, Gross had just been selected as superintendent of schools in New York, and he was succeeded by Sidney Marland, who came from Winnetka, Illinois, to become the new superintendent in Pittsburgh. And Marland, at the same time in 1964 that I was offered the Brookline superintendency, Marland offered me the opportunity to become deputy superintendent. So I had this dilemma. What was I to do? So I went to New York and spent time with Gross, and we went back and forth for a couple of hours, and then finally he said, well, what do you want to be? I said, well, I'd like to become a superintendent of schools. So he said, well, why don't you take the Brookline job, which I did. I arrived in Brookline in 1964, in June. It was my 35th birthday. And from the beginning, I felt that there really weren't enough professional help to assist me. I wrote a memorandum to the school committee at that time, and I said that unless you give me some professional assistance with the budget and personnel, I'm going to spend all my time either creating a budget or evaluating teachers by myself, and I'm not going to be able to help you with help do all the other duties of the superintendent. And they agreed, and they created a position of assistant superintendent for business and a personnel director. This was a school system of about 5,000 or 6,000 students. there were 8 K-8 elementary schools and 1 high school. What I found was that each of these schools was run independent of the other. In fact, there were 3 report cards for each school times 8, so there were in effect 24 different report cards used to evaluate student progress. And yet, all of the youngsters came from these 8 elementary schools into 1 high school. And what I found was, through program budgeting analysis, that there were 4 have schools or upper income schools and 4 have not schools or lower income schools. In fact, one day I was in one of the lower income schools and I picked up a book from one of the children, and it indicated that that book had been discarded by one of the have elementary schools and sent to the have-not school. Well, I knew immediately that that was something that would have to change. And so I instituted a program to equalize educational expenditure for the 4 have-not schools. In addition to that, the school committee had indicated that they wanted to have me build new schools because a number of their schools were old. And so the first thing I did was we did a survey to determine whether the K-8 system should be kept or should we consider adopting an elementary, middle, and then move on to the senior high school. I found the evidence was very clear that the K-8 model was the most effective model because it eliminated at least one transition. And so we launched a building program, and I focused on replacing the old schools from the have-not districts first. The first new school that we built was to replace the old Pierce School. In 1963, a year before I came to Brookline, a group of citizens who were part of the Civil Liberties Group came to the school committee at that time and said that the race relations issues in Boston were causing that school system to provide an unequal education for children, and was there anything that Brookline could do to help that particular situation? And at that point, the school committee had created a study committee chaired by one of the school committee members, Leon Trilling, who was a professor from MIT. I joined that committee, and we met with some of the black leadership in Boston, Ruth Batson and Paul Parks in particular. And from that discussion, we developed the notion of a busing program that would involve busing 3,500 minority youngsters from Boston out to about 30 suburban school districts. Initially, the youngsters were not ready to take some of the AP courses, but as a result of spending more time in the Brookline schools, by the time that they came to the high school, we had plugged a lot of those problems, and they were able to take these courses and do quite well. And thus began the METCO busing program, which still exists today. Now, when we started that program, we didn't think that the problems in Boston would last more than 5 years, and we thought the program would end at that time, but here it is 50 years later, and it's still in existence because it's still needed. One of my core beliefs is that schools serve the entire community, not just educating children from 9 to 3, and the buildings should be used, if necessary, 24/7, throughout the entire week. Two programs that fit into that philosophy. One involved the establishment of the extended day program. A group of parents came to me from the Driscoll School and said, we work, and in order to live in this community, we need both parents working, or both guardians working, whatever the case may be. And we need some kind of a program that will take care of our children from the end of school until about 6 o'clock, when we can then pick them up on the way home from work. I thought that was a legitimate request, and so I sat down with a member of the school committee, Natalie Zuckerman, and Virginia Thompson, who is the venerable principal of the Michael Driscoll School, and we began to do some research as to whether or not such a model existed anywhere else in the country, and we couldn't find anything. And so we worked together and created this program. It was to be a parent-run program. Each of the schools would have its own board. They would each be autonomous, although later on we formed a board called the BDAC board, which coordinated the activities of all 8 elementary schools. And the schools contributed space, and initially at the time services from the custodians. The parents paid for the tuition of their students, and it was on a sliding scale, so that the more affluent parents paid more than the parents who required a scholarship, and later was responsible for getting money from the Brookline Community Foundation to provide these scholarships for the students. And this program has been in existence since 1972. Following Driscoll, the other 7 elementary schools eventually created their own models. They have their own faculty. Those faculty, in some cases, it's worked out that some of them were then recruited as Brookline teachers. So it's provided a real benefit to the Brookline Public Schools as well. The extended day program is so important that many parents, when they consider moving into Brookline, check to see if they can get their children into the extended day program even before they figure out which elementary school they're going to go to. So that was one example of using the facilities beyond the normal school day. Sometime in the early 70s, the state put out a request for bid. They were ready to identify 2 communities that would be interested in using the schools to help senior citizens. And naturally, since Brookline has a very large senior citizen population, I was very interested in exploring that, and we did become, along with Pittsfield, we became the 2 site centers. And what we did, we took 2 of the elementary schools, Devotion School and the Pierce School, and opened it up to senior citizens. That helped the senior citizens, particularly those who had lower income. Our role was to provide the hot meal and the site, using the schools when the lunchroom was no longer needed by the children. And we also worked with the town government, particularly the health department led by Dr. Alan Balsam, and they provided the manpower, the nursing and all the other health resource people. Later on, of course, when the town came together and established a senior center on Winchester Street, the program was no longer needed, but at least it was the forerunner of services to seniors in Brookline. In the late 60s, early 70s, a small group of faculty came to meet with me. They were concerned about the fact that Brookline High was a large school, about 2,000 students, and they noted that there were some youngsters that had difficulty making an adjustment to working and learning in a large environment. And they proposed an idea where there would be a small core group, a math teacher, a social studies teacher, a guidance counselor, science, and what they wanted to do was to take a small portion of the building for 100 youngsters. And so I thought it was an excellent idea because I believe very strongly that children, you've got to match teachers who are interested in a certain teaching style with youngsters who would learn in different ways. And so fortunately there was a fourth floor area of the building that we could provide for these youngsters. And the reason why it worked well is because you had a dedicated small group of faculty who worked with these youngsters, and it made a great deal of difference in their lives and in the way in which they were able to learn at Brookline High School. There was a professor at Boston University by the name of Ralph Mosier, and Mosier was interested in working with the school within the school to see if they could launch the democratic high school model. And the model that he developed was that the 100 students and the small core of faculty made all the decisions about teachers to be hired to replace those who retired, the curriculum itself. They were involved in all aspects of the decision making. They set rules for student conduct as a group of 100, and then eventually we extended that model to the rest of the high school. And so we had kind of student town meeting design, and when Carmen Rinaldi, who had been the headmaster for a good number of years, retired, I brought in a former social studies chairman, Bob McCarthy, who was dedicated to that program, and he continued it. One of the things that I discovered when I came here was that for 75% of the student population, the college preparatory program worked very well and had had deserved success. But for 25% of the students who were not going off to college, there was really nothing for them in the way of program offering. We developed a proposal to establish occupational education programs at Brookline High School, and since that time, there's been a very active occupational education program at Brookline. We instituted 3 programs: food and restaurant management, child care. Fortunately, there was an existing high school kindergarten section, which my own children went to, and that was used for the child care program, and then the other program was the automobile program. There was an existing auto program that had been going on for a good number of years, and it consisted of a 1935 Ford engine on a block, and that existed at the old manual training building, and that was the way they taught about automobiles. I didn't think that made any sense, and so fortunately there was a youngster in that program whose father was the famous architect, Richardson, Henry Richardson. And I approached Mr. Richardson and I said, is there any way that you can open up the side of the Manual Arts Building and put in a ramp so that we could actually drive real live automobiles in to be serviced and to use that as a basis for the program? And he said, of course. And he proceeded to, on a pro bono basis, do that exactly. And from that point on, we were able to use real live automobiles. The 60s and 70s were probably the most productive, exciting time to be in the field of public education. There was more federal money given to schools at that point. And if you were innovative in spirit and in mind, there were resources to help you carry out your innovative ideas. The federal government was very active in the 60s and 70s in providing support for education. They were particularly interested in collaborative arrangements between school systems in particular. And so a few colleagues of mine, Chuck Brown, who was the superintendent in Newton, and Rudy Folbert, the superintendent in Lexington, and Bill Orenberger, who was the superintendent in Boston, we got together and decided that if we could create a collaborative, an education collaborative, that would particularly focus on the special needs youngsters. We applied to the federal government for funds to set up what became the Education Collaborative, or EDCO, organization. It's still in existence today. We've expanded the school systems that have been involved. We included the Archdiocesan schools as the law required. And this program essentially provides services for special needs youngsters that no one school system by itself could provide. So one day at Temple Israel, where I was a member, a man came up to me, a Dr. Laufer. Max Laufer asked me, he said, Bob, why is it that the schools don't teach anything about the Holocaust? And I was intrigued with that question. And we formed a study committee made up of the representatives of the various faith, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish representatives, faculty that might be interested. And we decided to hold two separate conferences that we opened up to the region, and we invited Professor Eric Goldhagen of Harvard and Lawrence Fuchs of Brandeis, experts in that field of Holocaust studies, and they outlined for this regional conference what the content would be. And then we held another follow-up conference to talk about the methodology. In other words, we knew approximately what the content would be. The next question is what would be the teaching techniques used to carry out this particular program. Zabrick had invited two social studies teachers from the K-8 elementary schools. One was a woman by the name of Margot Sternstrom, who was at the Runkle School, and another was Bill Parsons, who was at the Lincoln School, and they attended both conferences. They became so interested and enthusiastic about the program that they went off on their own and created a resource book called Facing History and Ourselves. And that became the locus for an organization. At the same time, because we were involved in a building program, we had moved ahead and we had acquired a future site for a new Lincoln School. And on that site was a former home, the Kennard House. And I turned that house over to Facing History and ourselves. By this time, it had incorporated, become a 501c3 organization. I helped it raise money. I worked with Kitty Dukakis, the governor's wife, and other people to raise funding for Facing History. And that's the launching of what has now become, under Margot's leadership, an international organization. One of the changes that Margot made was that she moved from simply focusing on the Jewish Holocaust and the Armenian genocide, which were the two initial foci of that program. She moved to have it focus on genocide, universal genocide, which would include all of the genocides in Africa and everywhere else in the world. It gives them insights into man's inhumanity against man. I think it hopefully makes them more tolerant, people of different backgrounds. I mean, it helps in their moral development, and so that's an invaluable tool, and also the responsibility of education to do that. For many years, I had been thinking about the research, which indicates that the most formative years of a child's education is from birth to about age 8. But if you look at the expenditure of education in the public or private schools, we spend more money at the high school level than we do at the beginning years of education. And that's largely because it has equipment costs. The teachers tend to have more advanced degrees. So I talked about that with one of my senior people on my staff. He was the director of Pupil Personnel Services, Francis McKenzie, who was a Yale Ph.D. Graduate, and a very, very scholarly person. He was in charge of all pupil personnel services in the Brookline schools. And from that, we then branched out and we involved Dr. Burton White from the Harvard School of Education, who was an expert in early childhood. We involved Julius Richmond, who was the physician who was the person who actually was responsible for launching Head Start throughout the whole country. We had a whole series of experts that we engaged. White then developed a model that would have us work with mothers in utero and then provide services to those mothers and follow the children throughout their education. And I took that model, which later became known as the Brookline Early Education Project. I took that model to both the Carnegie Corporation Foundation and to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and each one of them contributed $2.5 million, which in the 1970s, $5 million investment from foundations was a considerable amount of money. We then recruited 285 mothers in utero. 1/3 of those mothers came from the Heath Bromley Housing Project in Boston, because we wanted to make sure that we had a representative span of income level. And we had 3 levels of services. The most intense level involved lots of home visits with medical care and nurses and social workers, etc. There was a kind of middle level of services, and then a more superficial level. And we applied those 3 levels to all of the income groups. And then we admitted the 1/3 of those babies from the Heath Bromley Project came into the Brookline schools through the METCO program, so that they would then have comparable education to the Brookline babies who lived here. What we found at kindergarten and 2nd grade was that the youngsters from the poorest families who had the most intense treatment showed the most gain. And then about maybe 5 or 7 years ago, a group of researchers from Boston College decided to go back and to see how they were doing as adults now. And they found that the beat babies from the Heath Bromley Project, who had had the most intensive level of treatment, were better educated, were healthier, had complete family structure, etc. And it merely showed that if this country were to invest in particularly to helping lowest income families with this kind of service, they could go a long way to solving many of the health and job preparation programs. It would make a tremendous amount of difference. Unfortunately, we don't seem to learn from these experiences. And of course, we've continued it, the model, part of the model in Brookline. The B program still exists. It provides services for 3- and 4-year-olds before they come into kindergarten. 1981-82 was a very difficult time because the Prop 2.5 had passed statewide. I had actually played a role. I was the state chair among school systems trying to fight the success of that particular proposition, which limits the growth of the town and school budgets to 2.5% a year. I said to myself, well, with Prop 2.5 passing, the schools are going to have less resources. So what we have to do is to, even though we're a public institution, we have to see if we can raise private money to supplement some of the money that will lose as a result of Prop 2.5. So I sat down with a group of citizens in the community, one in particular, John Hodgman. We created the Brookline Education Foundation, which is still in existence today, gives out about $250,000 a year to Brookline teachers and administrators to supplement their ideas and to give them support that ordinarily might have come originally from the budget. And the advent of Prop 2.5 caused me a tremendous amount of pain because it came down to saving teaching positions, kindergarten teaching positions, in fact, versus maintaining the K-12 directors of instruction, which I had put in when I first came. And these positions had made a great difference in my judgment. They provided for a uniform curriculum for all children, and I think created a school system as opposed to a confederation of 8 elementary schools and 1 high school. And so the only way that the school committee could maintain and hold on to teaching positions was to dismantle the K-12 directors of instruction in all the subject areas. And so in about 80, 81, I started to think about what I would do next in my career. And eventually came to the conclusion that what I wanted to do was to work at the university level and affect public education, particularly in Boston. I felt that that's where the greatest need was for my services. And that led me ultimately to John Silber, the president of Boston University. And so in 1982, after 18 years of service to the Brookline Public Schools, I left there to assume this new position at Boston University. I came over to Boston University as professor of education and special assistant to John Silber. This was to be the beginning of another 20 years of association with both this dynamic, amazing leader, as well as other very interesting colleagues that I work with. In the mid-70s, the Boston school system was deemed to be in de jure segregation by Judge Garrity. And he ordered the school system to desegregate. At the same time, in addition to the busing program that he initiated, he asked the heads of all the universities and colleges in the Boston area if they would help the Boston Public Schools. And he had a similar conversation with the heads of the business and corporations, banks and insurance companies in Boston. The university presidents, 28 of them, said they would be happy to cooperate, and they formed an informal organization to do that, made up of the presidents themselves, and each of the presidents had a senior faculty person as the coordinator of activities for their college. When I joined that group, I noticed that the work had been going on, was loosely administered. And I felt that it was important, first of all, to give the group a name and to establish their brand. And so I gave them the name of the Boston Higher Education Partnership, and because Silber was the chair of the president's group, I became de facto the executive director. The colleges contributed during the course of a 16-year period. They developed grants jointly with the Boston Public Schools. They offered scholarships to the graduates, and they also provided pro bono services. As an example of the scholarship program, the most generous was the one that John Silber created. He awarded each year 54 full academic scholarships to the top 54 students in the Boston Public Schools. And that was an amazing contribution. Later on, at the request of the Cardinal, he also developed 13 Cardinal Madera scholarships for 13 top graduates of the Catholic schools as well. Laval Wilson was the superintendent at the time, and he said, "Bob, we have the need to change the makeup of the Boston principals. They are all basically white and male, and I want to get women into the leadership roles. I want to get Latinos. I want to get blacks. I want to get Asian educators in these roles." And so I sat down with a group of his principals and asked them to identify some of the biggest needs in the Boston Public Schools. And from that list of needs, we developed a concept called the Boston Leadership Academy. We trained 140 promising teachers in the Boston Public Schools, largely female, largely black, largely Latino and Asian. And each year we trained 35 of these of the ultimate group of 140 over the 4-year period. Boston selected half of that group, 70 of them became school principals in Boston. The Leadership Academy was developed with the help of a colleague from the business school, Gerald Leader, who happens to live in Brookline. And we took the idea of the Leadership Academy to Richard Smith, the head of the General Cinema Foundation, and he was so impressed with the program that he basically underwrote the full cost of the program, and so he gave us about $800,000 over a 4-year period. It cost us about $7,000, roughly $6,000 to $7,000 a year to train each of the 35 people that we train per year. John Silber was a person of vision, but he was also a very demanding person, and he could be very irascible. You had to meet his standards, and if you didn't, he would let you know. For many years, John Silber offered to take over the administration of the Boston Public Schools. And each time he did that, when they were searching for a new superintendent, they would say no. And so one year, actually it was about 1986, he received a call from a man by the name of Andrew Quigley. Mr. Quigley was the chair or president of the Chelsea School Committee. Chelsea is an extremely poor community. It's one of the poorest communities in the Commonwealth. It has always been a gateway community for immigrants coming into the United States, coming specifically into Massachusetts. It is a heavily Latino population. It was run by a very strong minority of white political leaders who really didn't invest very much into the city. Quigley was an interesting person, and he said to John Silber, "I know that you've been interested in running an urban school system. Would you be interested in running the Chelsea schools?" And Silber met with Quigley and with Richard Volk, who was the majority leader in the House at the time. And finally, from that series of meetings, emerged the understanding that the Boston University would take over the complete management of the Chelsea schools. In order to do that, Mr. Volk introduced a bill in the legislature which in effect transferred the administrative rights of running the school system in Chelsea to Boston University. And because of Volk's position in the legislature, that bill passed. From 1986 to 1989, a 3-year period, Silber then appointed a group of us to serve as the future management team of the Chelsea schools. We didn't officially take over until 1989. So from 1989 to 2009, Boston University was responsible for the running of the Chelsea schools. Chelsea continued to elect school committee members, but their only role was in the case of any issue that the BU management team, any decisions that they made, the Chelsea School Committee did have the right, by a 2/3 vote of the school system, of the school committee, they had a right to overturn decisions. And the only time that they did that was when the management team voted not to allow the distribution of condoms in the high school because of the AIDS epidemic. I was given the responsibility by Dean Greer, who at that time was the dean of the school, Boston University School of Education. My responsibility was to see if we could get new schools built. And so in those early years, I worked out an agreement with the Chelsea Redevelopment Authority, and they gave us a 10-acre tract in Chelsea that we could use for the development of new schools. Along the way, between 1989 and over the years that we were there, the entire city went into receivership. That is, they were bankrupt, and the Governor Weld, and the legislature actually took over the running of the entire community. And he appointed James Carlin as the receiver and Harry Spence as the deputy receiver. One day, I got a call from Harry Spence. We need that 10-acre site that was given to you for new schools. We need that because we want to build in Chelsea a new Department of Revenue building that would provide over 1,500 new jobs for the city of Chelsea. I said, Harry, that sounds like a great idea, but I want something in return. And he said, what is it? I said, I want you to get your boss, James Carlin, to get on board to support new schools for Chelsea. So the two of us, Spence and I, worked back and forth between Carlin and Silber, both of whom were very single-minded individuals. And we eventually worked out wording in which Carlin agreed in return for the 10-acre site, he would then support new school buildings for Chelsea. And so in order to proceed, I hired two educators, Oliver Brown and Ed Kazanjian, who I knew about, and they developed the educational program, and they also developed the idea that we needed special legislation which would give the Chelsea schools 95% state aid for building these new schools. And because we had the three heavyweights from the executive office and the Senate and in the House, the bill passed and the governor signed it. So we ended up then designing and building 7 brand new schools, and then we rehabbed one of their old schools to become the center for all 3- and 4-year-olds in Chelsea because of the importance that both Silber and I gave to the need for early education. The total amount of money for those projects, which came in under budget and on time, was $116 million. Chelsea actually never ended up contributing their 5%. All they had to do was to give that 10-acre site, and they had all of these new facilities, which proved to be a tremendous magnet for parents and ultimately led to parents wanting their kids to be in the Chelsea schools. In fact, people asked me over the 20-year period that during that time, they said, how do you know that the Chelsea schools profited from Boston University's leadership? I said, well, we had a lot of data. We had indications of more advanced placement courses, more kids staying in school, the dropout rate was reduced, more kids going off to college. We had the introduction of 3- and 4-year-olds. 80% of all 3- and 4-year-olds in Chelsea receive early education. I said, but to me, the most significant indication of the success of the BU partnership with Chelsea was the fact that we knew of about 75 families that had lied to get their kids into the Chelsea schools. They were willing to run the risk of ultimately being discovered. I can say that because of the success that Boston University had in running the school system, that it had an effect of raising the entire economic base of the city. And now it's a community that also has attracted some wealthy or rising middle class who have moved into parts of the city as well. This was my only superintendency. And so among many things that gave me satisfaction was the opportunity to become part of this community, to educate my own children here, and then to see that the innovations that I mentioned earlier in my summary, that every one of those innovations is still in existence in some form, in many cases exactly the way we introduced it. That's given me a tremendous satisfaction to know that these were such fundamental needs of the community and the children that subsequent superintendents and school committees have kept these programs going. Finally, because of my deep commitment to the social justice needs particularly of underprivileged people who don't have the same resources, I've had this great sense of satisfaction that I was able to be associated with a profession that would make it possible for people who needed help to get that help through the institution of public education. In 1957, 5 days after I received my doctorate, I met Edith on a blind date, and we were married for almost 55 years before she passed away in 2012. We had 3 wonderful kids, Matt, Larry, and Beth, and 7 grandchildren.